Rome, year 1122. In a narrow, windowless room, an iron cross hung like a threat. On one side, the emperor, on the other, the legacy of Peter. A whispered oath there would shatter centuries-old chains and redraw the map of faith. You're watching Faith and Power. Today we unveil the secret treaty that ended the investiture controversy and redefined who truly ruled over crowns and altars. If historical truth intrigues you and faith moves you, subscribe now, ring the bell, and comment who really won in. Worms, the Pope, or the Emperor? Pay close attention. Behind this signature lie broken promises, drowned ambitions, and a surrender that looks like victory. Stay until the end and judge for yourself the hidden history. The sound of bells no longer called only for mass. It called for war. The cold air cut the skin, carrying the scent of smoke rising from pillaged villages. Altars and crowns waged a struggle measured not only in armies, but in broken oaths and letters sealed with threats. It was the end of the 11th century, and the investiture controversy was turning every church into a fortress and every bishop into a chess piece. Gregory VII, once known as Hildebrand, wore the papal tiara with the determination of a general. He declared that only Rome could invest bishops and abbots, wielding the ring and the crozier as spiritual weapons. To the Holy Roman Empire, this sounded like a direct challenge. Henry IV, the young emperor, did not retreat. He defied the Pope, was excommunicated, and lost the support of German princes who could smell opportunity. The scene at Canossa, an emperor barefoot in the snow, became an eternal symbol. It brought no peace. It only fed the flames. The decades that followed were a cycle of humiliation and retaliation. Armies marched, rival coronations fought for legitimacy, and cities were looted in the name of God. Bishops shifted loyalties as easily as changing banners, calculating where they would best survive. When Henry V inherited the throne, he also inherited the open wound. He had no intention of kneeling like his father. His reign began with military force, imposing appointments and deposing opponents. But every victory came at a high price. Restless nobles, rebellious cities, and paralyzed trade routes. In the eyes, Vatican, popes came and went amid internal conspiracies. Some sought peace, others total victory. The dispute was no longer purely theological. Appointing a bishop meant controlling castles, collecting taxes, and influencing decisive votes in the imperial diets. German princes, weary of war, wanted stability. Merchants demanded safe roads, and monks pleaded for silence to copy psalms. The emperor realized the sword would not solve what was carved into the pride of Rome. Then came the murmurs. A meeting could end the dispute. Not surrender, but a pact. A delicate negotiation where every word would carry the weight of iron. Name began to circulate. Worms. The city on the banks of the Rhine had a strategic location at the heart of the empire, yet far from Rome's direct influence. A neutral stage, though watched by eyes from every side. Reaching it would mean overcoming ghosts. The ghost of Canossa, where an emperor knelt. The ghost of papal legates insulted in public squares. The ghost of burned villages and broken vows. Messengers departed carrying proposals, none of them direct. Every sentence was crafted to concede without yielding, to give ground without appearing weak. If the emperor relinquished the ring and crozier, could he still secure indirect influence? If the pope accepted the sovereign's presence in elections, would that not reopen the door to old chains? As letters crossed mountains and rivers, omens were watched with feverish attention. A comet streaked through the winter sky. A fire destroyed part of a monastery in Saxony. Markets grew quieter, as if trade itself feared to breathe. Henry V knew he would return from Worms either as a victor or as a traitor in the eyes of his own. Rome, for its part, feared that a poorly written treaty could become an invisible shackle on the church. The mood was that of a chess game played with blades. There was no room for error. A poorly placed clause could cost entire territories. A misread gesture could rekindle the war. Princes prepared to accept agreements they did not want. Abbots feared that peace would come with a spiritual price. Soldiers, used to marching, distrusted the quiet that approached. Worms began to fill, with travelers, diplomats, spies, monks, merchants, soldiers, and the curious. The city's towers rose against the gray sky like stone sentinels, watching those who arrived. Inns overflowed. Taverns buzzed with theories and rumors. Each side came convinced they were about to defend not only their power, but the very order of the world. For the emperor, it was a matter of keeping the throne free from papal shadow. For Rome, it was about protecting Christ's authority from the hands of a temporal monarch. When the first delegations passed through the gates, a strange silence settled over the streets. The meeting had not yet begun, but everyone could feel the weight of centuries pressing on those days. The stage was set. And under the veil of incense and the echo of hooves on cobblestones, Europe waited to see whether Worms would bring peace or an even more relentless war. When the delegations settled in Worms, the city itself seemed to shrink. Narrow streets stifled whispers, and every window became an eye. No one spoke of God without also mentioning taxes, walls, and oaths. The imperial throne demanded obedience. The throne of Peter demanded purity. Between them stood real men with tangible fears. Princes, bishops, abbots, merchants. All had accounts to settle. All wanted peace, but a peace that wouldn't cost them their own future. In hastily rented rooms, maps covered tables like heretical carpets. The Rhine flowed there, inked in black, surrounding wealthy dioceses like islands. Every border was an open wound. A bishop elected under imperial shadow meant troops. A bishop elected under papal blessing meant independence. Neither side would admit it, but both were bargaining over the same gospel. Who could touch the sacred without selling their soul? The German princes did not arrive as humble subjects. They came as creditors. Their armies had endured long sieges, and previous harvests had withered. They wanted guarantees, open roads, preserved tolls, predictable courts. A compliant episcopate served the emperor's interests, as long as Rome agreed not to turn pulpits into weapons. They were not theologians, they were survivors. If the treaty strengthened them, they would stand by it. If it shackled them, they would sabotage it with the patient silence of castle lords. The prince-bishops were a living contradiction. Shepherds with armies, confessors with blacksmiths, theologians with their own coinage. They controlled bridges, mills, markets, and river crossings. They owed fidelity to God, yet their seats in the imperial diets depended on imperial favor. They feared losing their minting rights, and they feared for their souls. Many longed for a middle ground, free, election in the cathedrals, spiritual confirmation from Rome, temporal investiture by the king. Every comma in that arrangement was a stack of powder kegs. Henry V listened to his advisers as one might assess swords. One jurist argued for clear capitulations, another wanted a theatrical blow. His mother reminded him of the wound of Canossa. Generals demanded loyal bishops to fund the troops. The emperor noted it all but feared the invisible, appearing weak before the princes. If he surrendered the ring and the crozier, he would demand counterbalances. If he kept everything, he risked excommunication again. The mathematics of the throne left no room for sentiment. On the papal side, legates wove words like delicate chains. They spoke of the church's liberty, canonical elections, and the removal of simony. Yet they knew that liberty without walls was an invitation to invasion. They wanted to ensure no sovereign could turn the altar into a bank or a barracks. They demanded an explicit renunciation of temporal symbols. In exchange, they offered blessing and ceremonial participation, a game of calculated proximity, keeping the king close enough to control, far enough to restrain. Spies wandered between taverns and cloisters. They noted who whispered the names of desired bishops, who bought extra parchment, who avoided swearing on relics. A rumor was worth a garrison. Envoys tested speeches the way tinsmiths test hot solder. If a prince reacted poorly, they shifted emphasis. If an abbot frowned, they added conciliar citations. The goal was not persuasion, but lowering the cost of betrayal. In a stone hall, torches cast shadows that seemed to move on their own. Lay and ecclesiastical representatives spoke in turn, like hammers and incense alternating blows. The word liberty surfaced 10 times. The word order, 12. No one counted, but all felt it. A Saxon count rose. Without bishops committed to the realm, the borders would crumble. A legate replied, without bishops free from the king, the gospel would become currency. The silence that followed weighed more than armor. The free cities brought their own arithmetic. No theology survives without grain, salt, and credit. Urban councils sent letters supporting canonical elections, but demanded deadlines and predictability for oaths of loyalty. They wanted bishops to keep ports open, to refrain from confiscating goods under the pretext of penance. A sin punished. With an unjust fine became heresy against commerce. The treaty would have to tame both pulpit and ledger. There was still a conflict no one dared name. If the church accepted the king's sword in the moment of choice, would it not betray the martyrs? If the king relinquished all tangible gestures, would he not hand his people over to a foreign jurisdiction? The collective conscience swayed between fear and necessity. The only possible answer seemed to be a tense equilibrium, watched over, with shared rituals, separated symbols, and eyes always suspicious. On the third night, a single mistake nearly collapsed everything. An imperial secretary read aloud a draft with harsh terms about elections held in the presence of the king. The legates heard by order instead. The hall froze. Hands went to sword hilts, not to draw them, but out of muscle memory. Then came corrections, mitigations, a miraculous comma. It was agreed that words would be treated like walls. Each would have guards. At dawn, the Rhine struck its banks like a war drum. Candles flickered in oratories, and the scent of wax mingled with the metal of stacked armor. Henry V calculated. Risks. The legates offered short prayers. Princes closed their doors, swearing secrecy. All knew that yielding now meant saving crowns, mitres, and trade routes. All feared they might be signing away a future no one could control. That very night, the moon hung over Worms like a silent blade. The Rhine reflected its pale light, broken only by the slow movement of barges, some bringing late messengers, others carrying urgent notes beyond the walls. Inside the city, the rustle of footsteps, and whispers slid through narrow alleys. No gate creaked without someone taking note. No candle burned without eyes measuring its position. Henry V occupied austere quarters, surrounded by advisors who moved like ivory pieces on a war board. On the table lay 2 parchments, one bearing the text proposed by the Empire, the other, Rome's version. Between them sat an untouched chalice of wine, a mute symbol that no toast had yet been made. On the other side of the city, the papal legates met in a low-ceilinged room lit by tall candles. The air smelled of wax and anxiety. They argued over every phrase, every verb, as if words could raise walls. One, a veteran of councils and conspiracies, reminded the others that a poorly considered signature could hang the church's freedom for centuries. Another warned that refusing too much would only reignite the war. As the night deepened, corridors turned into rivers of hurried steps. Messengers crossed deserted squares under cloaks hiding their seals. In dark taverns, glasses clinked while spies gathered scraps of conversation. A rumor spread. There were secret terms, unwritten, to be sworn only between the central parties. No one knew if it was true, but everyone wanted to believe it. The princes, lodged in improvised palaces, wavered between skepticism and urgency. They knew that if the deal failed, their lands would again become battlefields. Some drafted letters to their vassals, preparing silent mobilization orders. Others gambled on a fragile peace that would keep harvests and trade routes open. In St. Peter's Cathedral, where the main meeting would take place at dawn, preparations unfolded with the solemnity of a ritual and the caution of a siege. Benches were polished, tapestries cleaned, torches placed so the light favored the center of the nave. Yet behind the columns, imperial soldiers and papal guards measured distances with trained eyes. Shortly before midnight, an imperial envoy was discreetly summoned to the legate's chamber. He carried a revised proposal, the ink still damp and the parchment trembling in his hands. Reading it, Rome's representatives exchanged brief glances. Some demands had been softened, others hardened. One detail stood out. The clause on the emperor's presence at episcopal elections had been drafted ambiguously. It could mean mere ceremonial attendance or effective control. It was the kind of ambiguity that kept alliances alive and opened the door to wars. Meanwhile, Henry V received reports from his spies. Some claimed the Pope had ordered his legates to seal the agreement that very night. Others said Rome preferred to delay, wearing the empire down with more talks. The emperor knew, however, that delays could tear apart the fragile network of commitments he had stitched together among the princes. In the cathedral cloister, monks walked in silence, murmuring psalms. Among them, 2 carried messages hidden in the folds of their robes. If peace was to come, it would not be born of miracles, but of hands calloused from calculation. At the first hour past midnight, a closed meeting took place in the imperial chambers. 3 princes, 2 advisors, and Henry himself debated the latest draft. One prince warned, yielding too much on investiture would weaken the throne before the regional lords. Another argued that holding too hard a line would only prolong the where. The emperor, hand resting on his sword's hilt, ended it. It is not victory I seek. It is the right to remain seated here. At the same time, the papal legates opened final instructions from Rome, sent days earlier, but unsealed only. That night, the words were clear. Preserve the liberty of the church, even at the cost of the throne's friendship. A phrase that could be read as an order for inflexibility, or as a license to negotiate, depending on who interpreted it. The hours crept forward. Guards rotated shifts, but no one slept. The Rhine kept its deep murmur. Somewhere in the city, a bell rang 3 times for no apparent reason. To some, it was a prearranged signal. To others, coincidence. As dawn began to pale the sky, a sharper cold swept through Worms. The city seemed to hold its breath. Inside the cathedral, torches were relit. The table for the parchments was draped in red cloth. Upon it rested 2 fresh quills, each set in a twin inkwell. One for the emperor, one for the chief legate. The corridors filled with firm footsteps. The imperial delegation and the papal party made their way to the central nave. No eyes strayed. No smiles were risked. Above, stained glass cast colored light onto the stone floor, as though history itself were preparing the stage. When the 2 sides met, the silence was absolute. Only the distant sound of the Rhine reminded them the world still moved. The moment of decision had arrived, and every word, every signature would strike a blow at the future of Christendom. The first sound to echo in the cathedral was the scrape of soles against polished stone. The delegations advanced toward the central table, flanked by torches that cast long shadows along the walls. The red cloth over the table looked less like a place of reconciliation than a battlefield. Henry V took his seat on the right, Rome's chief legate on the left. Between them lay two parchments, one to be read aloud, the other to hold the less publicized clauses. The murmur of the witnesses faded until it vanished. The air seemed heavier. The reading began. The imperial chancellor's deep voice carried each word with the weight of oaths and threats. The emperor renounces the right to invest bishops, with ring and crozier. The phrase fell like a stone in the hearts of his staunchest allies. But before the silence could turn into protest, came the counterweight. And shall retain the right to be present at canonical elections and to grant the corresponding temporal rights. The princes exchanged measured glances. Imperial presence at elections meant the throne would still hover over the cathedrals, even if it no longer touched the sacred directly. For Rome, the formal renunciation of the investiture gesture was a victory. For the empire, remaining in the ceremony was survival. The papal legate read his part. The words spoke of the church's liberty, of elections conducted under canonical rules, of the absence of coercion. But every phrase left room for interpretation. What was absence of coercion in the presence of a sovereign with an army at the door? What were free elections in dioceses where votes depended on feudal favors? In that moment, all understood that the signatures would not be an end, but the beginning of a fragile pact. Diplomacy had created a formula that could be read as victory by both sides. That ambiguity was both the cement and the crack in the treaty. When the reading ended, the inkwell was placed at the center of the table. Henry V gripped the quill firmly but paused. A ripple of hesitation ran through the hall. It was not doubt about the text. It was the awareness of its historical weight. To sign was to end a war of generations, but also to accept that the struggle would continue in subtler form. The quill scratched across the parchment. The legate did the same. Then other dignitaries added their signatures, like guards posted over a newly built bridge. Each stroke seemed to close one wound and open another. After the ceremony, gifts were exchanged. A silver chalice from the empire. To Rome, a marble reliquary for Henry. Symbolic gestures, but loaded with unspoken messages. The chalice, a reminder that imperial authority still drank from the cup of faith. The reliquary, a reminder that faith could shelter the empire. Outside, the people awaited news. When the doors opened, a herald announced that peace had been sealed. The crowd answered with restrained applause, as if afraid to wake something that had been sleeping. Many did not grasp the details, but all knew the sword would rest. At least, for a while. While the city quietly celebrated, within Worms' walls, parallel conversations bloomed. Advisors were already discussing how to exploit the text's ambiguities. The emperor pondered which dioceses he could influence without seeming to break the treaty. The legates calculated how to strengthen cathedral chapters to resist secular pressure. Night fell with a strange silence. There was no music in the streets, only the sound of the Rhine, steady and indifferent. In his makeshift palace, Henry V looked at the signed parchment on the table. The document was both trophy and shackle, carrying the glory of ending a conflict, and the shadow of conceding what his predecessors would never have allowed. Elsewhere in the city, the papal legates prayed. Not in pure thanksgiving, but in supplication that the treaty not become a trap. They knew the empire would search for loopholes, and that peace depended on constant vigilance. At dawn, Worms felt lighter. But in the corridors of power, the tension had not vanished. It had only changed form. The investiture controversy was officially over, but what had been divided there was not merely power. It was the very concept of authority over the sacred. The treaty did not eliminate the conflict. It merely pushed it into new arenas. Episcopal. Councils, princely assemblies, letters sealed and carried discreetly over the Alps. Every bishop elected from then on would be a test of the pact. Every local dispute would revive the memory that, despite the signatures, the struggle between crown and crozier had never truly been won. And so, as Worms awoke, both the Empire and Rome carried the same burden, to maintain a peace that, from the very first moment, already knew its fate. Worms awoke to the murmur of a cautious peace. The city gates opened like weary eyelids, and the Rhine flowed on, indifferent, witness to an agreement meant to reorder God and the world. The signatures were dry, but the parchment burned within. On every corner, something wavered between relief and unease, as though at any moment a trumpet could shatter the silence and summon back the banners. In the imperial camp, officers gathered, payroll lists with swift fingers. The war had ceased, but its costs remained. Princes sent messengers to reaffirm oaths, now under new rules. The sovereign's presence at elections would keep the scent of iron inside the cathedrals, even without, touching ring or crosier. It was a presence that needed no hands, only eyes. The domes would feel the breath of the throne even when every gesture appeared ceremonial. In Rome, incense rose with greater conviction. The renunciation of the investiture rite sounded like a doctrinal victory, and it was no small one. The Church preserved its formal freedom to choose its shepherds according to canon law, and the humiliation of the past was transfigured into guarded doctrine. Yet dawn carried a whisper through the corridors. Victories are heavy when they require armed guards. The thought clung to the walls, for no clause stands alone against a winter of ambition. Across the roads of Germany, effects arrived before explanations. Free cities reopened their markets, tolls began to flow again, monks returned to their scriptoria, blacksmiths tempered blades for tools. Still, each episcopal election promised a new test. Cathedral chapters strengthened their statutes, sought protection in charters, summoned notaries. A bishop elected without simony would be a triumph. One chosen under veiled pressure would turn the treaty into little more than new vocabulary for old chains. The empire, with its landscapes of valleys and fortresses, continued to fracture along lines of autonomy. Princes learned they could negotiate under the treaty's guard, and that a firm invocation of canonical elections could expand their leverage. The crown, stripped of the investiture gesture, demanded other gestures: presence, confirmation of temporal goods, military protection. The game shifted to spaces where quills and lances could touch without seeming to collide. In the heart of the Church, jurists sharpened arguments like blades. The Treaty of Worms cut deep into canon law, teaching that power is maintained more by grammar than by open violence. Decrees, collections, chapters, glosses, each line raised a parapet. The idea that the sacred had its own jurisdiction gained armor. Reform, once the fire of monks, descended into the courts, and from there built invisible cathedrals of principle. Meanwhile, Italy was fermenting. Proud cities weighed favors, money changers tallied war debts, rival family towers discovered that faith could legitimize business. Imperial presence on the peninsula gained new etiquette. Papal presence gained new eyes. Emerging factions realized that the conflict had changed attire, not soul. In time, new names would claim this memory with interest, as though the stones themselves had learned to speak. Henry V regarded the agreement as one looks at a river after surviving a flood. The banks remained, but the water carried unseen debris. Peace brought breathing space, but it cost symbolic authority. Without ring and crozier in hand, the throne had to recalibrate its voice. There would be discrete victories, won in the interval. Between election and confirmation, there would be polite defeats, written in flawless calligraphy. The emperor would learn that ruling after Worms meant negotiating with silences. Rome, in turn, redrew its atlas. Where once it faced a single sovereign, it now faced dozens of smaller powers, each trying to coil itself into the treaty's cracks. The Curia understood that defending the Church's liberty meant visiting markets, guarding archives, training canon lawyers, courting cities. The crozier weighed less in the hand and more on the page. The temptation to turn every election into a holy battle lingered in cloisters, and prudence would be needed to keep the sacred from dying of zeal. The people, always called in for the epilogue, received the most tangible dividend: fewer sieges, more bread; fewer blocked routes, more caravans. Yet the price of peace was a new attentiveness to the unseen. Whoever chose the bishop chose the bridge, the granary, the judge. Sermons began to invoke the treaty without naming it, calling for liberty and order as if they were two saints difficult to fit in the same niche. The squares learned to listen between the lines. History, which never sleeps, kept moving its pieces. New kings would try to reinvent their presence in elections. New popes would raise walls of words to contain them. In every century, the echo of iron and incense would return, reminding all that Worms was not a full stop, but a change of breath. In Rome, the cross would guard the map. In the empire, the eagle would guard the memory. Between them, a bridge of promises, watched over by human hands. At nightfall, the parchment still gleamed under the slanting light of a candle. Anyone who touched it would feel it was no simple document, but a blade wrapped in silk. The treaty had promised peace and delivered vigilance. It had promised limits and delivered disciplined disputes. The world, once taught to kneel in the snow, would now learn to measure its words. And as the Rhine kept its course, one certainty flowed with it. From that day on, the fate of Rome and the empire would be written in the precise space between what is yielded and what is kept. The Treaty of Worms officially ended the investiture controversy, but it did not erase its shadow. What was signed on that morning in 1122 was less an eternal pact than an armistice with an invisible expiration date. The emperor kept one foot. In episcopal elections, the pope kept the spiritual key. Neither side won completely, yet both proclaimed victory. In the years that followed, the agreement would be cited as proof of balance or as an example of naivety, depending on who invoked it. For the princes, it opened space to negotiate and solidify their autonomy. For Rome, it entrenched the doctrine that the sacred could not be made subject to the throne. For the empire, it preserved a presence in the shadows, where influence is built away from watchful eyes. But history does not tolerate a truce for long. New disputes would arise in other forms, with other crowns and other croziers. The tension between spiritual authority and secular power would stretch across centuries, shaping crusades, councils, and reforms. In every new generation, Worms would be remembered as either a lesson or a warning. Today, looking back, the treaty reveals more than political concessions. It shows both the capacity and the danger of turning faith into currency and politics into altar. It shows that the most lasting peace is often only a sleeping conflict, ready to awaken when someone dares to move a piece on the board. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Worms, to teach that in history there are no final victories, only provisional ones. Between the iron of crowns and the incense of altars, the silent struggle remains to decide who truly holds destiny in their hands. Because in the end, the question that has echoed since 1122 still has no answer. Who really governs, the cross or the crown?